Paediatric anaesthesia, what people usually remember about what we do is that we're the people that the government pays to give drugs to children. But in fact, on our best days, the best days that we have are the days where we actually build stories with kids. And that might be a story about diving underwater, or it might be a story that's about how you only ever lose a single sock because it's actually the kids' hospital taking them to make the funky gas that gets you under the anaesthetic. Or it might be the story about how we're going to teach your parent to maybe fly off into space and have an adventure. And that will start, of course, with a hug, because parents kind of need cuddles. And maybe we'll use the mask just like you've used before, and we'll use a balloon that you'll need to blow up really, really big because I forgot my rocket today. And as you go further and further up into space, you'll start feeling floaty. And then you might just start to smell some space people, because everybody knows they never have showers. You never see that on the telly. And before you know it, you will have taken your parent out beyond the stars and they'll be having a whole new kind of adventure. So to try and approach this today, I'm going to try and stick to what I know. I'm going to tell another story. And for this story, you have to try and think about being inside a little house in Sydney, a house that I share with my wife, who we've actually been going out since I was at school. And this particular day, she's given me a sleep-in after a big ICU shift. And after the sleep-in, she wakes me up and she says, I actually haven't felt the baby move, because we're actually expecting our first little one. Should be taking them home in a few days. And there's been a call to the midwife, and that's gone ahead, and they've said, well, maybe try a bath, or maybe try some ice, because, you know, sound, that does stuff. Or maybe try a Tim Tam, because that's pretty Australian, but that hasn't done the trick. And so now we're in a car, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit stressed at this point. And so we're driving across town and under through a tunnel, and we get there, and I'm thinking that's probably okay, because we've both worked at this hospital, because she's actually a peds reg. And we've worked at this hospital, and people do this all the time. They come in, they have a quick delivery, they've got a story for the end of the day. But I'm a little bit more stressed when they take us from the delivery suite down to where they're doing the ultrasound scanning room, because it's been a bit, you know, maybe just hiding, because babies hide, right? And we all saw that movement there, and it's okay, because the registrar that meets us is the one who was a couple of years ahead of us in uni. And she was amazing, like she knew so much, and she's going to sort it out. And so we sit there in a dark room with the midwife and this registrar, and we sit there and we look up and there's a screen, and I don't need training to know what it still looks like. And it turns out that we had a he, and he's dead. And trying to figure out how to talk about bad news for parents, I was trying to figure out how do you summarise all of them. And I think all of them have a single thing in common. What you are doing is you are taking away a future version of a story that somebody's created for themselves. They all share that in common. And if you go to the literature and you look, be it a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis or prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome or in the NICU or in the PICU or oncology, they all have this common theme that this is the sort of situation where the future that somebody had imagined is taken away from them in a really big hurry. And I didn't come to this conference just to go through this story. Like, in fact, that would actually be kind of easy to do. I turn up to conferences to drink questionable coffee and do some evidence-based medicine. And I am not holding a cup at the moment. So if we're going to do evidence-based medicine, what we need to do is go back to what Sackett first told us that we should do. And that is look at the best available literature. Take that best available literature and sprinkle it with some clinical experience and wisdom that everybody's gained in such a hard fashion. And with that wisdom, sprinkle in the perspective of what the patient, in this case the parent, needs. Their needs, wants, beliefs, desires. And so what I hope to demonstrate is one of the three. And I'm not just going to use my story, because again, that would be easy. I'm going to use the stories from a whole bunch of parents who were kind enough to let me do that. And hopefully refer to the literature. In fact, there'll be a bibliography at the end that you can go and link to and go through every individual paper, which I would encourage you to do. And hopefully you guys will sit there figuring out the clinical experience bit. Because what I hope you'll see at the end is that all of these things, at least in that first Breaking Bad News conversation, they have a lot of things that are in common. And there are approaches that we can do that make it the same, because what we're going to try and do is we're going to take away someone's future, and we have to start giving that parent back the tools that will let them start writing a new story. And we want to get them to that as quickly as possible. And some of those things are exactly the same. So the first part of Breaking Bad News is you actually have to get some information across. So imagine us in this scanning room, things just tumbling like we've been dumped, like you can't even believe. How is our obstetrician going to get some information through to us? Well, I can tell you what our obstetrician did do. She came in, and I remember her sitting down and reaching out, and she said, "This is a real thing, and we don't know why or how, but we have to do stuff now." Parent number 3, who was kind enough to speak to me, they're in a neonatal intensive care unit. And it's a week down the track from when they first arrived there. There was an event at birth. And they're waiting in a room for the medical team to turn up. The medical team turns up, and what they remember from that interaction is that there was a lot of talk. What they gleaned from it was a registrar saying, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, damage to the cerebral cortex, profound lifelong disability. And they remember feeling wounded. There are ways to go about getting across information. It's a common misconception that at high periods of stress you can't take information on. If you look at Needle's work in intensive care, only 7% of parents, 24 to 48 hours after their kid hits ICU, are incapable of taking on information to the level where they have good or excellent understanding of exactly what's happening. People are ready to take information on. In fact, they want to. If you turn up and just dump a whole lot of stuff in without giving me the individual bits to start rewriting my story, you have failed me as a parent. We actually want information at this point. We want to be guided step by step through it. But you also have to realise that if you're going to do it in these little bits for this massive thing that we have to start writing, you're going to have a lot of conversations. Parent number 2, who was kind enough to speak to me, they had a lot of conversations in the lead up as well, because at 10 months they'd had the conversations about why is it that we think something's wrong with our kid and nobody else can tell us. They had the conversations about, what are those bruises? You don't seem to be able to explain them. And finally, at 10 months, they have the conversation that gives them hope in the form of a diagnosis, but the sort of hope that only comes with a bone marrow transplant. So for that family, when you start that first conversation, imagine how many more conversations you are lining them up for. And so one of the key things that comes through in the literature in all those areas, be it cystic fibrosis, prenatal diagnosis, NICU, PICU, oncology, all of them, they come through again and again in the qualitative research, is that people want you to turn up. They want you to be available for discussions. They want you to actually be there physically, not just at a time that suits you. They want you to be there at a time that suits them, or at least gives them the time to have that conversation. And when you turn up and you're available, it's not about physically being there. You actually have to be available in the conversation. You have to be there in a way that lets you pick up what they're actually saying back. Because you have to figure out which of those individual bits is going to help them start making that story that they need to write very, very quickly. And that requires time and space. Again, doesn't matter which area you look at in the literature, this comes up again and again. How much parents value the fact that you might give them the time to ask the questions that they need, the space to really think about what's going on and trying to figure it out. Because one of the hardest things I think as medical practitioners, or the one that I find hard, is leaving silence. This will surprise you now that you're listening to how fast I tend to speak. But silence is a really confronting thing as a medical practitioner. It's really hard to allow silence to happen. Because we're used to clinics that are whirring away, that are always overbooked. We're used to the monitors in the critical care areas. We're used to the buzz of an emergency department. And so silence is one of the most confronting things that you will deal with. But what you need to understand is, for me, there's no silence. When I'm the parent there is absolutely no silence, because you have taken away the story that I've written for my future, and I am now trying to rewrite all possible futures that could possibly be about to unfold at this point. There are so many conversations. Remember parent number 3, who was in the neonatal intensive care unit? That parent was a week down the track. Had you noticed and picked up on that? And so when they were blindsided by this news, there had been a whole week for people to be available to break down the information that was coming. There'd been a discussion about cooling. There'd been a discussion about phenobarbital. And yet, a week down the track, they had no idea what was coming. You need to turn up repeatedly and be available. Now, before the next little section, I kind of need to confess to something. I'm up here talking about communication and various things like this. Like, I know a whole lot of stuff about language, but I know nothing about language because I'm a classic Australian. I have a single language, which is Australian. I kind of understand Australian. If I go overseas, I will probably find food and not starve. I will probably find a place to sleep, and about 30% of the time, I will get on the right train. But that's pretty much where the extent of my knowledge and my ability to interpret things finishes. Except for this time. In these conversations, you would be astonished how much parents take on board. Gilby, in work where they reviewed people who had been told that their kids had hearing loss, describes astonishment at the fact that 23 years later, parents can describe in exquisite detail who was in the room, what they said, how they looked at each other. You take everything in these conversations, and I can absolutely take tell you in detail what those conversations were like. Even as we had the subsequent conversations about what to do upstairs and who we should invite and do we go back and hold him. Even as we had the conversations with the hospital about maybe moving us away from the room where they turn up the volume to listen to baby's heartbeats. We had so many conversations, and I remember them all in detail. Parent number 4 who spoke to me, she's in a room with a paediatrician having a confirmation that her child is in fact on the autistic spectrum. And the thing she's taken away from that interaction is not the diagnosis or anything useful that was provided. What she takes away is that the paediatrician seemed really miffed that an allied health practitioner had first raised the possibility a week earlier. Like, that was the main point of that conversation. People pick up on this and they remember your tone and your empathy and your body language. Parent number 2, remember the one who got told about her child needing a bone marrow transplant? The setting for her receiving that news was that they're in a room, they're asked to leave their baby outside, which is, tough enough with your 10-month-old who's in there. They go into a room and they're put in this completely new room. There are 15 people in a circle, all looking at them. 2 parents with a chair in the middle. And I understand why the clinicians got to that point where they thought, we'll show them how much we support them. For the parents, 15 sets of eyes, most of whom none of you actually know, all sitting around it, and they felt adrift and isolated. Parent number 3, blindsided in that room. The room itself told the story before they got there. They walk into this room and she describes it as a dire place. This room where on the wall there are psalms framed and motivational quotes and a whole bookshelf with books about grieving. And then a nurse hands them tissues like they're going to need it. And now they understand exactly what they're there for. Everything around the words that you say is actually part of the communication, and you need to line everything up. You need to make sure that your words match your actions and match the setting that you're doing it in. I mean, there are really simple things like use a name. Bussard Allen in the neonatal literature, they describe in their qualitative research going in painstaking detail through a range of interactions in the neonatal intensive care unit, all breaking bad news. In over a third of those interactions, not a single clinician in the room used the baby's name. I mean, that's profound. This is not old research either. Use a name. Alexander's name is the only thing that pretty much we'll ever get to give him. To have a paediatrician use that name and then offer to examine him with the full range of his professionalism, it's an incredibly powerful thing. And parent number 1, the first time that I've mentioned them, parent number 1 is in an emergency room and they've just delivered a baby in the 2nd trimester. And you can imagine how devastated they are. The doctor looking after them picks up their child in front of them and puts them in the clinical waste in the room. This story is not old. And what you need to understand is that that will sit with that individual forever. They will be stuck in that place while everybody else moves on with things. So that first interaction, when you go to break the bad news, has a really profound impact. Happily for that parent, they found an obstetrician who really got it. They found a clinician who was entirely capable of taking time and space, making themselves available, providing them with information, and not just a little bit of information, really authoritative information, up to date, like they knew what they were talking about, with written stuff to go away with. And on a subsequent occasion when a similar thing happened, because some people are that unlucky, they showed that baby all the respect it deserved. They included that parent, and the whole experience was different. And there are other ways that we can lighten the load as practitioners, which is also a really powerful way that even if you are not faced with this in your day-to-day life, you can choose to go and lighten the load for parents anytime. Because you can be an advocate. It's hard to explain how exhausting it is to keep having conversations with people who don't get it, or to go and try and argue the case that maybe people should pay a tiny bit more attention, or to make them understand what it might be like without you having to explain it in detail. But as clinicians, we can do that all the time. We can go and talk on behalf of our kids and on behalf of the parents and actually say, this is what it's like, this is why this thing matters so much. To take stillbirth as an example, 1,832 kids, I think, were stillborn in 2012. Compare it to something like drowning. I think there was 38 kids passed away between 2015 and 2016 in that financial year. Or trauma, 260 kids severely injured who passed away over the whole of Australia that year. Where's the talk? You can advocate for research, you can advocate just to let people know what's going on. And that is a really significant thing, because what you will do is you'll provide parents with the time and space to not have to focus or worry about that. And time and space is what you need. Now I'm almost there, but I do have another story. Back in that first pregnancy with Alexander, we used to read books. It's a common thing that people do, right? And we used to read lots of different books, but particularly The Little Prince, which is, I mean, ultimately it's the main book that you need, because it kind of tells you everything you need to know. It tells you all there is to know about what's really essential, and importantly, how ridiculous and stupid adults are. And so we would read that, and during that story, the Little Prince explains that he's going to have to go back to the stars. And the pilot that he's been with is quite upset by this, and the Little Prince says, you don't need to be upset, because I'm going to give you a gift. The pilot's puzzled, because he's an adult, and adults are idiots, but the Little Prince explains to the pilot and says, well, I'm going to go up there, and I'm going to be on one of those stars, and you'll know that I'm up on that star, and I'm laughing. And so, when you look up, you'll have stars that laugh. There are some things that are very the same about what we can do to get parents back to where they need to be, so that they can create that new future for themselves, the story that they have to write. Now, for some parents, that story is going to be something about accommodating grief in their life and going forward with it and figuring out a way to go on and writing that new story. For some parents, their story is actually quite different. It's the sort of story where they have to rewrite a completely different path that they will walk with their child. But any which way, if we get the first conversations right, if we break the bad news better, we can give them the space and time to arrive at that new story a lot quicker than being distracted by all the other griefs that might afflict them. So if we can just turn up, if we can realise that we are going to need to go back and have repeated conversations, actually give them the information and break it up into ways that they need, that are meaningful to them. If we provide them with the time and space to really do that, then they'll be able to find the sounds that they need. They'll be able to create the story that they need to write. And that would be a lovely thing, to be able to look up at the stars and listen for some laughter. That's what I've got.